Welcome back to the channel. Now, most people walk right past certain coins without a second thought, but what if one of the most beautifully designed pieces in American minting history has been hiding in plain sight, quietly appreciated by serious collectors for decades? Today we're taking a close look at the Mercury Dime, a small silver coin with a surprisingly deep story behind it, from the artist who created it, to the historical moment it captured, to why authenticated examples in exceptional condition can carry real collector value in today's market. This one is worth paying attention to. First coin. In the early months of 1917, American coin presses were running hot, and the United States Mint was producing one of the most visually striking dimes ever to enter circulation, a small silver coin that would go on to captivate collectors for over a century. The coin most people call the Mercury Dime wasn't actually depicting the Roman messenger god at all. The winged figure on the obverse was Lady Liberty, rendered with breathtaking artistry by sculptor Adolf A. Weinman, her cap sprouting wings as a symbol of freedom of thought. Weinman had won a competitive design contract in 1916, and by 1917 his vision was already flooding into American pockets, purses, and cash registers from coast to coast. The Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco mints all struck dimes that year, each leaving behind a distinct mint mark, or in Philadelphia's case, no mint mark at all, and those small distinctions would eventually become enormous to the people who study these coins decades later. What makes the 1917 issue particularly fascinating is that it arrived at a moment of tremendous national tension, with the United States still technically neutral in a world war that was consuming Europe. And yet the economy was churning, commerce was moving, and this tiny 10-cent piece was quietly passing through millions of hands without anyone suspecting it might one day be worth far more than its face value. Weinman's design for the Mercury Dime is considered by many numismatists to be one of the finest achievements in American coinage history, and the 1917 examples show that craftsmanship in full force. The obverse presents Liberty's portrait in sharp, confident relief, her winged cap sitting elegantly above a face that radiates classical beauty rather than stiff formality. Turn the coin over and you encounter the fasces, a bundled bundle of rods enclosing an axe, an ancient Roman symbol of civic authority and collective strength, flanked by an olive branch representing peace. The design was controversial to some at the time who genuinely mistook Liberty for Mercury, but the artistic community recognized Weinman's work as something special almost immediately. The coin measures approximately 17.9 millimeters in diameter, weighs around 2.5 grams, and is composed of 90% silver and 10% copper, giving it a pale, luminous color that distinguishes it immediately from modern clad coinage. When you hold a well-preserved 1917 Mercury Dime under good light, the surfaces catch and scatter that light in a way that feels almost alive, the fields reflecting with a depth that modern coins simply don't replicate. And that sensory experience is part of why collectors keep coming back to this series generation after generation. The three minting facilities that produced 1917 dimes each tell a slightly different story through their coins. Philadelphia struck approximately 55.2 million dimes without a mint mark, making it the highest production issue of the three, and yet high-grade examples with fully struck bands on the fasces, what collectors call full bands or FB designation, remain genuinely scarce and command serious premiums. The Denver Mint produced around 9.4 million dimes, carrying a small D mint mark on the reverse, and the San Francisco Mint contributed approximately 27.3 million pieces with an S mint mark. These mintage numbers sound large, but consider how many of those coins were melted, worn to near oblivion in everyday commerce, damaged, lost, or simply discarded over more than 100 years, and the surviving population of truly choice examples shrinks considerably. The full bands designation is critical to Mercury Dime collectors, because the horizontal bands tying the fasces together are often the last detail to receive a full, sharp strike, and when a coin does show them completely separated and boldly defined, it tells you that the die, the planchet, and the striking pressure all aligned perfectly on that particular moment, a small miracle of industrial precision that most coins from this era never achieved. What separates an ordinary 1917 Mercury Dime sitting in a coin dealer's junk box from a specimen that makes a collector's heart rate climb is almost always a combination of strike, luster, and the absence of post-mint damage. Most circulated examples you'll encounter show varying degrees of wear across Liberty's cheek and hair, the eagle's feathers and the bands of the fasces, all softening gradually under the friction of daily commerce until the fine details blur into smooth planes of silver. Those heavily circulated coins, while still genuine silver and still historically meaningful, typically trade in ranges tied closely to their silver melt value, which fluctuates with the market but rarely puts them far above $1 or $2 per coin in very worn condition, and even moderately circulated examples might trade for just a few dollars in typical transactions, pleasant little pieces of history, but not the coins that drive auction rooms to attention. The coins that change the atmosphere in a room are the ones that somehow survived decades without ever really working. Perhaps they were set aside as curiosities, tucked into a savings jar, or simply struck near the end of a good die on a well-prepared planchet and never released until much later. When those coins surface in high-grade holders from PCGS or NGC showing grades like MS65 or MS66, especially with a full band's designation attached, the conversation shifts entirely, and estimates for such pieces can range from several $100s into the low thousands depending on the specific issue, the eye appeal, and the competitive appetite of the buyers in the room on any given auction day, though it bears repeating that these are estimates, never guarantees. And the market is always moving. There are also the variations and oddities that serious collectors hunt with particular dedication, because the 1917 Mercury Dime series contains a handful of intriguing possibilities that push beyond the standard Dayton mintmark collecting pattern. Doubled die varieties, where the working die received more than one impression from the hub at slightly different alignments, can produce coins where the lettering or design elements appear to have a faint ghost image, slightly offset from the primary design, a subtle but verifiable manufacturing anomaly that has nothing to do with post-mint damage and everything to do with what happened inside the mint itself. Repunched mint marks, where the D or S punch was applied to the die more than once at slightly different angles, are another category of variety that specialists examine closely. Off-center strikes, where the coin wasn't centered properly in the collar when the dies came together, can produce dramatically displaced designs that look almost surreal, with portions of the coin entirely blank while the struck areas appear perfectly detailed. These aren't the kinds of things you can identify with certainty by squinting at a coin in poor light. They require proper magnification, reference materials, and ideally comparison with documented examples. But finding one in a collection that was assembled without full knowledge of what it contained is exactly the kind of discovery that fuels the dreams of people who dig through old coin lots at estate sales and flea markets on Saturday mornings. If you believe you might have a 1917 Mercury Dime worth examining more closely, the first responsible step is simply to understand what you're physically holding before reaching any conclusions about its value. Start with weight. A genuine 1917 dime should weigh approximately 2.5 grams on an accurate digital scale, and anything significantly lighter may indicate a damaged, altered, or non-silver coin, while anything heavier warrants its own investigation. The color should be the cool, slightly gray-white of sterling-adjacent silver, not the brighter silver of modern clad coinage, and certainly not the copper-toned warmth of a zinc or steel base metal. Examine the rim carefully under magnification, looking for sharp, even definition all the way around rather than weakness or filing that might suggest alteration. Look at the lettering Liberty across the top of the obverse, In God We Trust to the left, the date at the bottom, and study whether any letters appear doubled, thickened, or show ghosting that wasn't caused by wear. Strike alignment matters too. The obverse and reverse should be properly oriented relative to each other, and any significant rotation from the standard coin turn alignment is worth documenting before you go further. None of this examination replaces professional authentication, and if you find anything that raises your curiosity, submitting the coin to a reputable third-party grading service like PCGS or NGC is the only way to get an opinion that the wider collector market will trust and act on. The emotional weight of a coin like the 1917 Mercury Dime is genuinely difficult to articulate to someone who hasn't spent time with old silver, but collectors describe it in remarkably consistent terms: a feeling of compressed time, of holding something that was already old before their grandparents were born, that traveled through a world in crisis and somehow survived intact. Imagine this particular dime being struck in Philadelphia in early 1917, slid across a drugstore counter in exchange for a newspaper whose headlines were warning of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, then passing through dozens of hands over the following decade before disappearing into a mason jar in someone's basement during the Depression, sitting undisturbed for 70 years until an estate was settled, and a grandchild found it wrapped in a handkerchief. That story, or versions of it that are completely plausible given the history of how people hoarded coins during times of economic stress, is exactly what makes numismatics feel like archaeology rather than mere collecting. The coin doesn't need to be rare to carry that emotional resonance, but when rarity and condition and historical significance all converge in a single small silver disc, the result is something that collectors describe as profound, and auction results sometimes reflect that feeling in dollar terms that can surprise even experienced dealers, always keeping in mind that past results are never a guarantee of future performance, and the market rewards patience, not it. and realistic expectations rather than wishful thinking. And so the 1917 Mercury Dime sits at this fascinating intersection of art, history, metallurgy, and human story. A coin small enough to lose in a coat pocket, significant enough to occupy entire chapters of American numismatic literature, and still appearing in unexpected places often enough that the dream of finding one in exceptional condition has never entirely faded from the collector's imagination. The circulated examples that show up in old coffee cans and inherited coin folders are honest pieces of American history worth preserving even if they'll never make headlines, while the rare high-grade survivors with full strikes and original luster represent the upper tier of what this series can produce, a tier that generates real collector competition and real market action when authentic, graded examples come to auction. The key is always knowledge, patience, and the willingness to pursue authentication before assuming anything about what you have. Because the difference between an educated collector and a disappointed one is almost always found in those steps taken before the excitement gets ahead of the evidence. Somewhere out there right now, in an old estate collection that hasn't been properly cataloged, in a jar of pocket change inherited from a great uncle who never threw anything away, in a lot of unsorted coins sitting in a dealer's back room, there are 1917 Mercury Dimes waiting to be found and properly evaluated. And some of them, just a few, might be exactly the kind of discovery that reminds you why people fell in love with coins in the first place. But before we leave the Mercury Dime behind, keep that thought close, because the very next coin we're about to explore carries its own quietly astonishing history. A coin whose story begins with a mistake so significant that the mint tried to correct it mid-year, and whose rarest surviving examples have been known to stop serious collectors cold the moment they see them. Next coin, 1925 United States Mercury Dime, and you are holding a sliver of American history that most people pass over without a second thought. A coin that carries within its engraved lines the spirit of a nation caught between two world wars. The Mercury Dime, officially known as the Winged Liberty Head Dime, was introduced in 1916 as part of a sweeping redesign of American coinage. A project driven by the mint's desire to refresh the nation's currency with sculptures that reflected classical beauty and modern ideals. But by 1925, the coin had already settled into its role as everyday pocket change, yet something peculiar was happening in the mint's Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco facilities. Production numbers were fluctuating wildly, and the dies used to strike these dimes were wearing out faster than anyone anticipated, creating subtle but fascinating variations that would drive collectors wild a century later. You see, the 1925 Mercury Dime isn't just a piece of silver. It's a snapshot of the Roaring Twenties, a time when jazz was filling the airwaves, prohibition was forcing speakeasies underground, and the United States Mint was struggling to keep up with the demand for coinage while simultaneously battling the inconsistencies of aging equipment and hand-punched mint marks. The visual poetry of this coin is undeniable, and that's where its real magic begins. On the obverse, you have the profile of a young Liberty, her features sharp and determined, wearing a winged Phrygian cap that was meant to symbolize freedom of thought, though the public immediately misidentified her as the Roman messenger god Mercury, and the name stuck ever since. Her hair is delicately waved, with tiny wings sprouting from the cap's base, and the details in her ear and the nape of her neck are so finely engraved that they often become the first areas to wear down on a circulated piece. Flip the coin over and the reverse presents a Roman fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe representing unity and strength, flanked by an olive branch that speaks to peace, a powerful juxtaposition that feels almost cinematic in its duality. The designer Adolf A. Weinman poured his soul into this composition, and every line tells a story of classical allegory reinterpreted through an early 20th century American lens. But here, where the mystery deepens. The 1925 issue was struck across three mints, Philadelphia with no mint mark, Denver with a D, and San Francisco with an S, and each location produced coins with distinct personality traits, from the sharpness of the strike to the placement of the mint mark, which was punched by hand into each working die, leading to slight positional shifts that now serve as fingerprints for authentication. Now let's talk about the production numbers because they reveal a hidden layer of intrigue that separates the common from the coveted. In 1925, the Philadelphia Mint churned out over 26 million of these dimes, a hefty mintage that makes them relatively easy to find in lower grades, while Denver produced just over 4.4 million and San Francisco followed with roughly 5.1 million, figures that sound large but shrink dramatically when you consider how many were lost, melted, or worn down to slick silver discs over the past century. What makes this year particularly fascinating, however, is the phenomenon of the full bands designation, a grading term that refers to the horizontal bands binding the fasces on the reverse. If those bands show complete uninterrupted lines with distinct separation, the coin's value can skyrocket because most 1925 dimes suffered from weak strikes that left those bands mushy and indistinct. You have to imagine the massive presses hammering down thousands of times a day, the dies gradually losing their sharpness, and the silver planchets, slightly harder than modern alloys, resisting the full impression, so that only a fraction of the 1925 mintage ever exhibited that crisp, photographic detail that collectors now obsess over. This is where the hunt becomes personal, because you might find a 1925S in a junk bin at a flea market, its surfaces scratched and darkened, only to discover under a loupe that the mint mark sits slightly tilted, a known variety that sparks quiet excitement among those who know where to look. The collector appeal of the 1925 Mercury Dime isn't just about rarity or price tags. It's about the tactile experience of holding a coin that has passed through countless hands during an era of extraordinary change. Think about the fingertips that touch this dime, a flapper buying a ticket to a silent film, a bootlegger counting his illicit earnings, a factory worker paying for a loaf of bread during the economic boom that preceded the Great Depression. The silver alloy itself, 90% silver and 10% copper, gives the coin a distinct ring when dropped on a table, a sound that's warmer and more resonant than clad coinage. And over time, that silver develops a natural toning that ranges from deep charcoal to iridescent blue and gold, a chemical reaction to environmental sulfur that no two coins replicate exactly. Collectors often chase after original, uncleaned surfaces because wiping or polishing destroys the delicate luster and reduces the coin desirability. And the 1925 issue is particularly sensitive to cleaning due to its finely engraved fields that trap dirt and grime in ways that make improper cleaning painfully obvious to an experienced eye. There's also the subtle intrigue of die varieties, repunched mint marks, doubled dies, or even die cracks that appear as tiny raised lines across Liberty's cheek, each one a tiny error that transforms an ordinary coin into a conversation piece, a forensic puzzle that connects you directly to the mint workers who labored over hot metal and heavy presses nearly 100 years ago. As you begin to consider the market for these coins, it's essential to understand that condition is the absolute king, and the difference between a well-worn example and a pristine specimen is not measured in mere dollars but in the very narrative of preservation. A 1925 Mercury Dime graded good 4, with its major details still visible but worn flat, might be a humble entry point, while an extremely fine 40 example will show clear separation in Liberty's hairlines and most of the reverse bands, commanding a respectable premium that reflects its survival against decades of circulation. But step into the realm of mint state grades, particularly MS65 or higher with that elusive full bands designation, and you are entering a completely different stratosphere, where the coin's surfaces appear as though they were struck yesterday, with cartwheel luster that spins across the fields as you tilt it under a lamp. In such high grades, the 1925D and 1925S become significantly scarcer than their Philadelphia counterparts. Because the Western mints often produced coins with shallower strikes due to die pressure issues, meaning that even if a coin avoided wear in circulation, it might still lack the sharpness required for top-tier grading. This is where the serious collector's passion ignites, not from a promise of quick wealth, but from the challenge of locating a coin that combines original mint luster, razor-sharp details, and eye appeal that transcends the grading slab, a treasure that might surface at a major auction or, just as likely, in a dusty album at an estate sale, waiting for someone with patience and knowledge to recognize its quiet significance. Now let's address the realistic conversation about value, because it's only natural to wonder what such a coin might be worth, but we must tread carefully and clearly. In the broader collector market, a typical 1925 Mercury Dime in average circulated condition might be valued modestly, often reflecting its silver content and modest numismatic premium, while an authenticated, professionally graded example in mint state 63 with average strike characteristics could see valuations that reach into the hundreds, driven by collector demand for quality-type coins. If you are fortunate enough to possess a 1925S or 1925D that earns the full bands designation at MS65 or above, you're looking at a much narrower population, and such coins have been known to command prices in the thousands in recognized auctions, with some exceptional specimens, those with flawless surfaces, deep original toning, and perfect strike, occasionally reaching auction records that spark widespread discussion among serious numismatists. However, and this is critical, these figures are never fixed, never predictable, and never a guarantee because the coin market is influenced by shifting collector preferences, the availability of competing examples, the subjective opinions of grading services, and the broader economic environment, meaning that today's high estimate could shift tomorrow based on a single comparable sale. There are also rare Mintera varieties from 1925, such as off-center strikes, clip planchets, or double-struck pieces, which can attract their own niche following and when certified by reputable services might achieve values that surpass even the finest regular-issue coins. But again, these are anomalies that require expert attribution and carry no assurance of financial return. The responsible path for anyone holding a 1925 Mercury Dime is to approach it with a detective's curiosity rather than a speculator's greed, beginning with simple, non-invasive examinations that respect the coin's integrity. Start by weighing it on a precision scale. It should tip at approximately 2.5 grams. Any significant deviation could indicate a counterfeit or an off-metal planchet, both of which demand further scrutiny. Observe the metal color. Genuine silver should have a bright, white appearance with a subtle sheen, while copper-nickel fakes or plated imitations will often display a duller, more reddish hue under good lighting. Check the strike alignment by holding the coin between your fingers and rotating it slowly, ensuring that the obverse and reverse are properly oriented. Any notable rotation could point to a die adjustment error that might interest specialists. Pay close attention to the rim details. The 1925 issue should have a full intact rim with crisp beading, and any signs of smoothing or filing could indicate damage or cleaning, which drastically affects both desirability and any potential market interest. Examine the lettering on both sides, particularly the Liberty and the date numerals, because variations in the shape of the 2 or the 5 can sometimes reveal die states or repunching that add historical depth to your particular coin. Above all, resist the temptation to clean, polish, or dip the coin in any solution, because the natural patina is a historical record that professionals rely upon for authentication and grading, and once removed, it can never be restored. Ultimately, the wisest course of action, if you believe your 1925 Mercury Dime possesses exceptional qualities, is to seek out a professional grading service such as the Numismatic Guarantee Company or the Professional Coin Grading Service, which will authenticate, grade, and encapsulate your coin in a tamper-evident holder that provides both protection and third-party credibility for any future transaction. These services employ teams of experts who use high-resolution imaging, comparative die studies, and metallurgical analysis to confirm that your coin is genuine and that its grade reflects its true state of preservation, and their opinion carries significant weight in the collecting community. Before you make any decision to buy, sell, or consign such a coin, it is imperative to consult multiple reputable dealers, review recent auction results for comparable certified examples, and understand that the final value is a negotiation between willing parties, not a static number set by any guidebook or price index. The 1925 Mercury Dime is a masterpiece of American numismatic art, a tangible link to a transformative decade, and a testament to the craftsmanship and occasional chaos of the early 20th century minting process. Its worth ultimately lies not solely in any dollar amount that might be assigned to it, but in the story it carries, the history it has witnessed, and the quiet thrill of discovery that comes from truly seeing a coin for what it is. A small, silver mirror reflecting the ambitions and anxieties of a nation finding its modern identity, one delicate strike at a time. Last coin, the 1925 Mercury Dime was struck at all 3 active minting facilities, Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, each contributing its own distinct production run to the national coin supply, and each leaving behind a slightly different numismatic legacy that collectors have spent generations trying to fully understand. Philadelphia produced the largest share, striking approximately 25.6 million dimes without a mint mark, while Denver added around 5.1 million pieces carrying a small D on the reverse, and San Francisco contributed approximately 5.85 million bearing an S. These numbers might sound abundant, until you begin calculating how many coins were lost to time, melted for their silver content, or worn beyond recognition through decades of honest commercial use. And suddenly, the available pool of genuinely collectible survivors starts to feel considerably more intimate than the original mintage figures suggest. Adolf Weinmann's design for the Mercury Dime had already earned its reputation as one of American coinage's finest artistic achievements by 1925. But examining a well-struck example from this particular year offers a fresh opportunity to appreciate just how much visual information Weinmann managed to compress into a coin barely the size of a thumbnail. The obverse carries Liberty's portrait facing left, her winged Phrygian cap rendered with enough sculptural depth that individual feather impressions are visible on high-grade examples, her hair flowing behind her in carefully modeled waves that catch light differently depending on the angle at which you hold the coin. The legend Liberty curves above her head in clean Roman capitals, and In God We Trust appears to the left in smaller letters tucked naturally into the field, while the date anchors the bottom with the kind of quiet confidence that well-designed coinage always projects. What separates a 1925 Philadelphia dime in circulated condition from one in true mint state isn't just surface preservation. It's the entire emotional register of the coin, the way the luster moves across the fields in unbroken cartwheel patterns on an uncirculated example versus the flat, friction-softened surfaces of a coin that spent years moving between fingers, registers, and coat pockets. The reverse presents Weinmann's fasces design with the same exacting attention, the bundled rods and axe head sitting upright between two horizontal bands while an olive branch extends to the left. And it is precisely those horizontal bands, referred to by collectors as the full bands, that determine whether a 1925 Mercury dime is merely a nice coin or something that serious numismatists pursue with genuine competitive intensity. The full bands designation is arguably the most important single factor in establishing whether a 1925 Mercury dime crosses from pleasant historical artifact into genuinely sought-after collectible. And understanding why requires a moment of consideration about how coin dies actually functioned in a busy industrial mint in the 1920s. A die began its working life sharp and fresh, capable of transferring even the most delicate design elements cleanly onto a planchet, but every strike brought it incrementally closer to failure, wearing down the high points of the design imperceptibly but continuously until the fine details, particularly the horizontal bands on the fasces, began to fill in and lose their definition. A coin struck early in a die's working life from a well-prepared planchet under ideal pressure conditions might come away showing those bands as crisp, fully separated horizontal lines, while a coin struck later from the same die might show the same bands as a soft, indistinct merge rather than a clean separation. This is why the full bands designation from a reputable grading service carries such weight in the Mercury dime market. It isn't a subjective aesthetic judgment, but rather a verifiable technical characteristic that reflects the specific mechanical circumstances of a coin's production, and those circumstances were never guaranteed regardless of how experienced the mint workers operating the presses happened to be. The 1925D in particular presents full bands examples as notable rarities given the relatively modest mintage from Denver, and when authenticated examples in high grades with that designation have appeared at auction, the response from the collector community has reflected the genuine scarcity involved. Beyond the fundamental question of full bands, the 1925 Mercury Dime series holds a range of variety possibilities that reward collectors willing to study their coins carefully under magnification, rather than simply noting the date, mint mark, and overall grade. Repunched mint marks represent one category worth investigating on the Denver and San Francisco issues, occurring when the punch used to apply the D or S to the working die was struck more than once at slightly different positions, leaving behind a coin where the mint mark appears to have a shadow or a slight second impression visible at a specific position relative to the primary letter. Doubled die obverses, while not among the most dramatically documented varieties in this particular year, remain a theoretical and occasionally documented possibility in any Mercury Dime issue, given the hubbing process used to create working dies and the inherent potential for slight misalignment between successive hub impressions. Die cracks and cuds, raised lines or lumps on a coin's surface corresponding to cracks or breaks in the die itself, can occasionally add collectible interest to individual examples while serving as useful diagnostics for connecting coins to specific die marriages and production sequences. Off-center strikes, where misalignment between the planchet and the collar during striking produces a coin with blank areas and a shifted design, represent the most visually dramatic category of error and can occasionally surface in old accumulations that were never carefully examined, though authenticating any error coin through a reputable third-party service is absolutely essential before drawing conclusions about what you have. Thinking about where a 1925 Mercury Dime might have traveled in its first years of life adds a layer of historical texture that purely numismatic analysis tends to undervalue. A dime struck in San Francisco in 1925 might have been used to buy a newspaper announcing Charles Scopes's conviction in Tennessee, or dropped into a slot machine in a Nevada establishment operating somewhere in the ambiguous legal territory of that era, or tucked into a child's birthday card alongside a note explaining that 10 cents represented genuine value and should be saved rather than spent. By the time the Depression arrived a few years later, many Americans were hoarding whatever silver coinage they could manage, tucking dimes and quarters into coffee cans and mattresses as faith in banks eroded dramatically. And some of those hoards sat undisturbed for decades before eventually surfacing through estate sales and family inheritances. This is one of the most plausible explanations for why genuinely high-grade Mercury dimes from the mid-1920s occasionally appear in the marketplace looking far better than their age would suggest, not because they were preserved with any particular foresight, but because they were simply set aside during a moment of economic fear, and then forgotten long enough for nostalgia and numismatic interest to catch up with them. The coins that emerge from those circumstances carrying original luster and sharp strikes are the ones that generate the most intense collector response, and the 1925 issues are no exception to that pattern. When the subject of market value enters a conversation about 1925 Mercury dimes, the most responsible starting point is acknowledging that most examples you encounter in the real world, in dealer bins, at coin shows and inherited collections, will be circulated. And circulated Mercury dimes trade in ranges that reflect both their silver content and their historical appeal rather than dramatic collector premiums. Heavily worn examples showing significant loss of detail across Liberty's portrait and the Fasces bands might trade for amounts close to their melt value, which fluctuates with silver prices but rarely positions common circulated Mercury dimes as significant financial assets in ordinary transactions. Moving up through the grade spectrum, moderately circulated examples with clear dates, visible mint marks, and some remaining detail might attract modest premiums from type collectors or beginners building Mercury dime sets, while sharply struck coins in the higher circulated grades begin to generate more serious interest, particularly if they carry scarcer mint marks like the 1925D, the genuine market excitement in this series. Where estimates sometimes reach into hundreds of dollars for high-grade examples, and can extend into the thousands for exceptional specimens with full bands designations authenticated by PCGS or NGC, reflects a real but narrow segment of surviving coins, and it's critically important to understand that these figures represent possibilities observed in specific market conditions rather than guaranteed outcomes for any coin you might examine. The difference between a coin worth $20 and one worth $2,000 can sometimes appear subtle to the untrained eye but becomes definitively clear only through professional authentication, and no amount of personal optimism substitutes for that process. Examining a 1925 Mercury dime properly before reaching any conclusions about its significance requires patience, good lighting, appropriate magnification, and a willingness to set aside wishful thinking in favor of careful observation. Weight is always a useful starting point. A genuine example should register approximately 2.5 grams on a reliable digital scale, and meaningful deviations from that figure deserve explanation before the examination proceeds further. The metal color should present as the distinctive cool silver of a 90% silver coin, subtly different from modern clad coinage in ways that become easier to recognize with experience, and any obvious copper tunning around the edges that suggests a clad composition rather than solid silver warrants close attention. Strike alignment between obverse and reverse should follow standard coin turn orientation, with significant rotation from that baseline representing an anomaly worth documenting. The rim should be consistently defined all the way around both faces, without filing, smoothing, or alteration that might suggest someone has tampered with the coin's surfaces in an attempt to improve its apparent grade. Lettering on both faces deserves examination under magnification for any suggestion of doubling, thickening, or offset impressions that don't correspond to wear patterns, and the mintmark on Denver and San Francisco examples should be studied for any signs of repunching at the base or sides of the letter. All of these observations contribute to a more informed preliminary assessment, but they ultimately lead to the same responsible conclusion: that professional authentication from a trusted grading service is the only foundation on which meaningful collector or market decisions should be built. The 1925 Mercury dime occupies a particular place in American numismatic history that goes beyond its mintage figures and grade populations, representing a moment when the country's coinage was genuinely beautiful, when silver still flowed through everyday commerce, and when a 10-cent piece carried enough purchasing power to feel meaningful in an ordinary person's pocket. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that coins from this era are still circulating through collector hands a full century later, still generating genuine excitement when an unusually well-preserved example surfaces, still connecting the people who hold them to a world that operated on completely different assumptions about money, value, and daily life. The collectors who pursue Mercury dimes with the most dedication often describe the series not as a financial strategy, but as a sustained engagement with American history expressed through small silver objects. And that description captures something true about why these coins retain their appeal across generations of numismatists with very different backgrounds and collecting philosophies. Whether the 1925 Mercury Dime you encounter turns out to be a common circulated example worth a few dollars, or something more unusual that warrants professional evaluation and careful market research, the process of examining it thoughtfully and learning what it represents is itself a form of engagement with the past that no auction result can fully quantify. Somewhere out there, in a collection assembled by someone who is no longer around to explain its contents, in a bank bag of old coins sitting in a safe deposit box that hasn't been opened in 30 years, in a handful of change passed across a flea market table without anyone noticing what was mixed in among the modern clad dimes, a 1925 Mercury dime is waiting. And the next coin we're about to explore carries a mystery of its own that the mint itself spent years trying to quietly resolve.